Hello everyone. This week we're looking at planning for special age groups. I think if we think about elderly parents or grandparents, we think about youth in society and children. When we think about other groups that have special needs as well within society, and this week is really bringing focus to that. And I think particularly if we think about healthy rural and small town communities, if we've not done an adequate job of planning for these people that have interesting or special needs, if we've not done an adequate job of providing the services for these people, it raises a question in my mind: how can we have a healthy and rural town small community in that context? So this week it's really bringing focus to that group, to those groups, as part of our course. There's obviously going to be a bit of a focus on the on seniors and the elderly as part of this because of the impact that's happening within society, particularly as we look at the baby boom or population aging. And the needs that will increasingly be in effect. And I will point out now and later that within that context, there are specific issues for rural communities that we need to be thinking about as well. This week, we will be looking at a series of videos and readings, and of course, assignment 3 is due next week, so hopefully people have made good progress on that. I'll take a moment to introduce assignment number 4 and 5, and we'll offer some definitions about what is planning for special age groups. We'll raise the question of why plan for special age groups and those with special needs. I think it's probably obvious, but why is that relevant? And what are some of the challenges, particularly for rural and small town communities? There's lots of discussion that occurs in that context around larger urban centers, but what are the needs of rural and small town communities? And looking at some of the issues and the tools that are relevant. In terms of the videos for this week, there's of course, and as there is every week, there's a slide deck that I prepared and then a video that accompanies it. We're looking at the slide deck and we're looking at the video concurrently. Dr. Charles Gardner is with us as he is many weeks, and George McKibben is also with us. And also a presentation that I attended in the County of Lambton back in the fall. And in particular, there was a session and a presentation by folks from the health unit from Lambton County on age-friendly communities. And the presentation by Anita Trussler and Jennifer Graham, I think, is well worth looking at. I will note that the video quality of that is not as good, I don't think, as the video quality of most videos that we've prepared because it's taken across a room. I encourage you to bear with it though, because I think the content is really good, and the closed captioning at the bottom of the YouTube video will allow the words to come forth if you do have any difficulties hearing it. So hopefully you'll find that to be helpful. Also the readings, the slide deck that we have in front of us on the screen right now. A report on Grey County age-friendly planning, actually done by a group of my students from 2 or 3 years ago, that I think you will find to be quite good. They've covered some of the literature that's relevant. They've also covered some materials from the province in terms of what would be helpful to look at. And there's a report to the Association of the Municipalities of Ontario, Strengthening Age-Friendly Communities. It's more around the services, I think, for the seniors than it is around the planning side of things, but still quite helpful to look at. As mentioned, I wanted to provide some overview. We've talked about this early in the semester in terms of the various assignments, but assignment 4 is a journal or reflections. And really what it relates to are weeks 7, 9, 10, and 11. This is week 7, and so for this week and the 3 weeks, next week is a session where we all come together, but the 3 following weeks after that, it's to spend some time thinking about what you've learned through the videos, what you've learned through the readings, and to convey that into a series of personal reflections. One thing I always encourage people to think about when you're writing reflections: don't just regurgitate what you heard, but spend some time thinking about it, spend some time reflecting on it, and offer your perspectives back to me in terms of what you might have learned in that. Maximum of 750 words, so it's not overly lengthy. Worth 10% and due in week 11, and again to reflect on those 4 topics that I just mentioned and that are listed on the slide deck. So hopefully that's clear. I think it's a fairly straightforward exercise, but to bring some focus to this latter part of the course. Assignment 5 is a more substantial project in terms of the weight. It's worth 30%, so it's important that people clearly understand what's expected of you. And within the toolkit itself, you'll have seen that previously. There are 13 actions which are included at the back. The action 13, for example, is climate change. And we've covered 6 or 7 of them within the course itself. But there's the opportunity to look at one of those 13 actions. It could be something we've already looked at, but to look at one of those 13 actions in a bit more detail and provide some more reflection on it. We've also asked that you identify a case study which would allow you to create something similar to what's at the back of the action, the toolkit. I'm just looking, for example, at page 54 and 55 right now, and you'll see there's a one-page summary of the County of Haliburton active transportation. There's a one-page summary of community engagement and volunteerism within the County of Huron. So as part of your, I'm going to call it a paper, although it's referred to it here as a more detailed overview of a given topic, the paper that you prepare as part of that will go into more depth, select a topic, select a case study area, review the topic, discuss how it applies or relates to the selected study area, speak to a local practitioner if that's helpful, and identify, as mentioned, an action, something that would be specific to which I just mentioned on pages 54, 55. And really what I'd like to do is add that to the compendium of innovative things that are happening across the province. I use the word innovative. It may be a standard practice, but something that's done really well. That we can add for other people to learn from your experience related to these various topics. So hopefully that's clear. Do week 12 worth 30%, and we will actually discuss your paper, your findings in week 12, coming together as a single group again. So I would like to ask if you have any questions, but I realize that doesn't work so well over the video. But if you have any questions, send me an email. We have on our discussion board, there's an opportunity as well to insert specific questions related to each of the assignments so that everybody can learn from any questions that you might have. Think of it as a standard paper with that opportunity for that one-page case study at the end. Okay, so let's move into this week's content where we look at age-friendly community planning. And included here is a definition, and a reference to where that definition comes from is provided, and I'm going to read it. An age-friendly community is a community where policies, services, and physical space are designed to enable people of all ages to live in a secure and accessible physical and social environment. Age-friendly communities contribute to good health and allow people to continue to participate fully in society throughout their lifetime. It's always interesting to deconstruct the definition of that because I think there's a number of important considerations. It's reference to policies, services, and physical space, really the things that planners are so concerned with. And it's also about all ages, and again, much of the attention is given to seniors, but when we think about all ages, what about children? What about people with special needs? How do we make sure that they're accommodated through accessible physical and social environment as well? And of course, contributing to health and allowing people to participate fully in society throughout their lifetime, which I think is a really important consideration. It's often said that we can walk much longer than we can drive. So if there's an opportunity for people to walk, they can meet their daily needs in appropriately planned communities, whereas if they're reliant on the automobile, it's much more difficult to do that. So it raises a bunch of really interesting questions that go back to our discussion around active transportation and what that might mean, to the design of communities and what that might mean, and bringing this into the context of thinking about age-friendly communities. It might be mentioned in one of our other videos where someone had, I don't know, it may have just been something that I talked about with one of my students, which is the notion of doing the walkable communities audit that you did earlier. If you had a chance, want to go out with your dog for a walk or just go out for a walk that route again, but pretend that you're an 85-year-old person doing that walk and think about what you encounter. And if you think about that, that starts to bring focus to what does it mean for an age-friendly community in the context of walkability, what does it mean in the context of the services, what does it mean in the context of other things that might be available within the community. So give that some thought. That definition, I think, is really helpful. As we think about healthy rural and small town communities, there's a variety of things we could look at: services, employment, broader demographic trends, the special needs of others within our communities, and I've put etc. there because that could be a really lengthy list. I've captured a couple of snippets really from the Ontario Rural Institute. Focus on Rural Ontario. If you're not familiar with these, for other assignments, they're a real treasure trove of information. There's probably 30 or 35 of these summaries that they've put together. The two that are flagged here are components of population change and Ontario youth employment rates, both of which are relevant for the topic that we're looking at. And the components of population change are to bring focus to the fact that within rural Ontario, we have many areas that are growing significantly. We equally have areas that are losing population. And I think for many people, that's a surprise to understand that in this population of growth, all of the tension around the GTA as an example, you have many communities that are losing population. What are the needs for those communities from an age-friendly perspective versus those that are actively growing? We'll come to that in a bit more detail, but I think it's pretty important to consider. And of course, youth employment rates say a lot about whether youth are going to stay in a community or move on, and what it might mean for the demographics and the long-term future of those communities is key as well. The Ontario Professional Planners Institute released a call in June of 2009 on planning for age-friendly communities, and they called it a call to action. The document looks like this. In fact, this is the document, and I'm going to be drawing some materials from that. I was the president of OPPI at the time that that was released, and have a real personal interest in the outcomes of it as well. So it's suggesting a number of things that as planners we should turn our attention to deal with the changes that are being occurring within society. So to understand and learn about demographic changes and shift in society. And I think you can think about your own community, what's happening, how it's changed over time, what does that future look like. I deal with municipalities across the country, and I'm surprised at how many I still think have not got their head around the demographic changes that are happening. And I think it's really important that we consider that. Also to comprehend the health trends and implications of community-based options, what's happening with the health of our residents, the health of community members, and particularly if you think about the demographics, if you've got an elderly population, there's some specific issues that will need to be dealt with in the healthcare system. We're also thinking about the municipal approaches to serve today's and the future's aging population. We think about, for example, recreation, and I've heard this comment made many times in the past. We spend all of our time investing in new hockey arenas for children, when in fact the needs might actually be parks and walkways for seniors, and to make sure at least there's a balance, appropriate balance between those two. Think about accessibility legislation. That's been a big transition in this province and elsewhere in the country over the last decade. And I spent some time years ago working with those folks who were physically challenged in terms of accessibility and so on, and how much progress has happened since that study was done 15, 20 years ago that I worked on. It says a lot. It's also really important to think about how we reach out to the different needs in society, and I might come back to that later. But the elderly, youth, but also if you think about those folks who might have physical challenges, it's difficult to accommodate them often within public consultation processes. So give some thought towards that as we do our engagement strategies. Consider climate change impacts, and which may more adversely affect the health of an aging population. If you think of extra heat, and we'll all be familiar with the news that will speak to heat waves that might be happening in Europe, where air conditioning might not be as available, and what that might do for the health of the elderly. And learn from senior-friendly municipalities and other best practices. There's a number of documents, this included, OPPI's materials as well on design, looking at senior-friendly communities in terms of what are some of the best practices that we might be wanting to accommodate. And certainly the corresponding video presentations that accompany this week speak to that as well. And avoid traditional stereotypes about older Ontarians. We find that people are more active, I think, today than they were historically, and have a real interest in their health and real interest. They tend to have enhanced financial flexibility than previous generations, perhaps, and will have different needs as part of that as well. The challenge, and this is again from OPPI's Planning for Age-Friendly Communities, include the following. The Canadian population as a whole is aging, and doing so more quickly than in the past. And you know, if people are familiar with population pyramids, which show the layout of the population in a graph with men and women and age cohorts moving through. We have a baby boom bulge that started after the Second World War, concluded about the 1970s, and that bulge of population has been moving through our age profile over the last 30, 40 years. And we can envision a time where that baby boom population is no longer part of society. And the question is, what does that mean for population trends in communities? So think about that. People are aging and will have specific needs in communities. People living longer, yet our population is experiencing high levels of chronic diseases such as diabetes and obesity. So that puts pressures on the healthcare system. Household composition is also changing. I'm always amazed that in communities with a fairly stagnant population, I think of the town of Goderich, which I'm very familiar with, at 7,500 when I was a kid, and it's about the same population today. But the number of households has grown significantly because family size has shrunk significantly. So many 1 and 2 person households, which we need to accommodate through housing. And of course, Ontario's communities will face different demographic challenges, which is to say, one rural community is going to be different than another rural community. So a community of growth in one sector of the province may be contrasted by a rural community of decline elsewhere. Also, OPPI has flagged in Ontario becoming increasingly ethno-culturally diverse. So what will that mean as population ages? And we have a little snippet here on the bottom from the Rural Ontario Institute on immigrant arrivals in 2014. How few of the immigrants moving to Ontario tend to end up in rural communities. And again, as these populations age, it will have a significant impact on needs into the future. Housing options remain limited. Many seniors are opting for aging in place in single-family housing. And again, there's specific needs there. Mobility becomes more limited and movement patterns change as we age. So as people get older, they have less ability to be out and about in terms of automobiles. Are they able to walk? What services are in place to assist them if they're not able to? And of course, as noted, the workforce is aging, which is to say for many rural communities with an aging workforce, the services that the elderly that are there rely on may be difficult to support in the years ahead if there's not a sufficient workforce to accommodate healthcare, personal needs, and so on. So those 8 points from OPPI are from the perspective, I would say, of the Institute as a whole, which is more urban-based. We've spent some time thinking about a rural perspective on those issues, and as noted, there's decline happening in some communities. Rural communities tend to have a higher proportion of elderly, and again, if we look at this snippet from the Rural Ontario Institute, we can see the proportion, 10 census subdivisions had a growth of more than 35% in the number of seniors and 80 years and older from 2011 to 2016. So in a 5-year period, a 35% growth in the number of census subdivisions. What does that mean and how did we deal with it? So a higher proportion of elderly in many rural communities. There's the issue of potential isolation. I think of my mother who stayed on the family farm. My brother had a second house there as long as she possibly could, virtually till the end of her life. And had it not been that my two brothers were on the farm, on one farm and then on another farm, so she had family around her, but how easy it would have been for her in a different context to have been isolated in that elderly period of her life. And I'm personally thankful for what transpired, but I do think of the other people in rural communities that don't have that support around them. The need for different housing options, whether it be cohabiting in some fashion, or certainly the need for nursing homes and other components in a rural community are difficult to provide in an accessible location because of the space that exists. The distances which impact youth and the elderly in the sense of services, youth in the sense of getting to sports or recreation or meeting with other kids, it's not always so easy. When I grew up on a farm, the farm landscape was much more concentrated. There were more farms and farm families around than there often are today in terms of the spaces that exist between farms and people in the rural countryside. Providing services with a low population density, how do you do that? How do you afford it? How do you manage to provide services to one person here when someone else needing that service might be many miles away. May be more difficult to age in place because of the presence or absence of services which have been mentioned previously. And again, coming back to the rural side of things, school closings. In many rural communities, that's a reality of life, some urban communities as well. But for those that are losing population, it's difficult to sustain the school-age population and in turn the schools. And what does that mean for a healthy community when there may not be schools present? Schools are present, it's just that they're a long way away. And of course, services for youth. That includes recreation, it includes other services that the youth in rural communities depend upon, such as 4-H clubs, other groupings of people coming together as well. So having identified the issues, the question is, what are some actions that we might take? And the Ontario Ministry of Senior Affairs suggests a 4-stage planning process of defining principles, assessing what the needs might be of the community, developing an action plan, and implementing and evaluating it. The next slide goes into that in a bit more detail. I encourage you to read it. I'm not going to repeat everything here. Suffice it to say, this is essentially a planning process that we apply in many different kinds of planning issues from the point of view of identifying principles, and there's some specifics there, such as form a steering committee, create guiding principles, create an age-friendly community profile, and so on. But it's a pretty standard planning process from defining local principles, what are the needs, customize the needs assessment, what would that look like, develop an action plan, and of course the importance of implementing, monitoring, and evaluation, which is to say, what are we doing well, what could we do better, and how do we make improvements. Again, there's specific tasks attached to each of those steps. I encourage you to look at that in a bit more detail. OPPI, again, through their Planning for Age-Friendly Communities, has identified various things to be thinking about, which I think are relevant. So these are a number of suggestions. They're not necessarily the solution to everything, but a number of suggestions. Thinking about the role of local hubs, and what OPPI is talking about in terms of, again, Healthy Communities age-friendly document, is hubs in the sense of consolidating services in single locations so they're more accessible for people. Pretty logical thing to occur, difficult sometimes to make happen, but certainly a goal that we might identify. Increasing the housing options, and we can often reflect on the size of homes that are built. We can often reflect on the diverse needs that might exist. I'm reflecting on a home, and again I'll use the example from the town of Goderich, a large estate home built generations ago, which was recently converted into 5 condominiums. So all of a sudden you take a home which is super large and you create essentially a small community of 5 dwelling units within this confined space, high quality, but relatively small, perhaps more in keeping with what the needs might be of seniors as they age. Simply to say there are diverse options that we should be thinking about. Design for healthy communities, the design aspects that we've talked about earlier in the semester continue to be relevant. Prioritizing alternatives for mobility. So again, it's a challenge in rural communities to provide public transit or public transportation options, but there are solutions out there. There's some really innovative things that are happening in some counties and regions that are worth considering. And I think most counties and regions are trying to think this through. Promote integration of uses and adaptive reuse. A good example of that would be the many schools in rural Ontario that have closed. Are there opportunities to convert it into housing? Are there opportunities to create it into incubators for small business startup and so on? And again, there are things that we should be thinking about in that context. Establish a meaningful voice. Elder councils are mentioned. Often youth councils are talked about, and that's simply to say we have elected municipal officials. There's an opportunity for parallel youth councils or parallel elder councils that would bring a lens to the needs of that group of society, that group within society on issues as they might evolve. Also, we should think about the way municipalities function and operate. Are there opportunities to better cater to the needs of an age-friendly community through the work that municipalities might do? and of course to build on successful models. And there's with youth, there's it's going to slip by me when I'm at the Fusion Youth Center in Ingersoll is what I was trying to think of. And that youth center is a really innovative strategy to provide services for youth. What's going on for seniors as well? There are successful models out there. How can we learn from those and capture them? The OPPI call to action recommends that all communities kickstart an age-friendly community planning process, which could involve the following. So 5 points to be thinking about. Prepare an age-friendly audit, a community audit. Really, unless we think about what's going on within our community, it's difficult to respond to the needs. So we need to really think about what's happening in our specific community in that context. What's some of the baseline data to understand the place-specific community composition? So that baseline data, demographics, employment, services that exist, and so on are really quite key. Identify priority issues and responses. So what are the things that we really need to address as you were doing, for example, the active transportation planning work? You'd be looking at what are the deficiencies within our community. Likewise, as we look at age-friendly communities, what are our deficiencies? What are the things that might not adequately be there for seniors? What are the things that might not adequately be there for youth as well? And then in turn, how do we respond to those issues? Create monitoring mechanisms suggested here on a 5-year increment basis, tied in with the census, which I think is a really fine idea, to review and manage demographic changes and impacts. You know, things happen, we don't always take the time, but how important and how basic that information can be to informing ourselves and informing local elected officials as well. And create a toolkit, success story manual, those things that work well. How do we capture them and how do we build on them? And there are a number of resources on the web that can assist in that context. So I'm going to, I've got another one here at the bottom, which is explore new partnerships or better integration of services between agencies and non-governmental organizations. I'm always amazed by how much work that occurs through through service clubs, as an example. That bring attention to the needs of society, and particularly the elderly or children, and to explore those partnerships. I found in many of the planning processes that I've been involved with, related to this and other topics, where you can integrate those various groups, how much more effective and successful you can be. And there's many, many stories of successes being enhanced by those partnerships. So just in conclusion, some questions to consider. These are things that are worth giving further thought to, just to bring pause for reflection to. So does the community housing stock accommodate age-friendly needs? What do you have in your community? Many rural communities tend to have only one form of housing, single-family dwellings. Smaller ones won't have any apartments or anything of that nature. Is that meeting the needs of society? How to engage age-specific and other groups? So, we've got the youth, we've got elderly, we've got other groups in between. How do we ensure that single mothers, for example, are able to participate in public processes? I remember doing an official plan process some years ago. We provided babysitting at the same time as the public meetings were happening. May or may not be feasible, but at least it's trying to give attention to other groups in society and their needs. What are the population and demographic trends? Also interesting to look at the local official plan and say, does it include age-friendly policies? Some will, some will not. But the more sensitivity there is to age-friendly policies, then the better off we are. How has accessibility legislation impacted your community? And finally, what other groups, such as young, students, or disabled, might have special needs within your community that need attention and need to be addressed? So those are, I think, good questions. There are many others that we could add, but certainly well worth reflecting on and might tie into your reflections that you're doing for the next few weeks. So next week, we will be coming together in a class meeting. The dates are on the course link, and we'll be meeting next Wednesday, I believe, is the proposed time, between 6:30 and 9 o'clock. And we'll have a discussion on assignment 3, which is your active transportation plan and the process that you went through. 3 questions we'll try to cover during that discussion. What did you learn from the existing active transportation plan that you looked at? What challenges did you encounter in working through the exercise? And there would be challenges that you weren't able to meet because of the time frames and the scope of your project. Other challenges that you might have expected to encounter, and what are your results? This isn't to be a formal presentation, it's a facilitated discussion, but if you want to bring a couple of slides, particularly that might speak to your active transportation plan, would be helpful. So look forward to seeing you in person next week. For those of you who aren't able to join us in person, I'll do my best to accommodate you through video conferencing in one way or the other, but do send me an email and we can explore that further. So thank you for this week, and see you next week.